Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HIT 445. We are now on week 6, and this week we will be covering 3 chapters, chapters 11, 16, and 20. We will be focusing on unit objectives 9.7.1 through 9.7.16, as well as 9.2.2. I hope you're doing really well. Just wanted to briefly remind you, you have a group assignment due this week. Hopefully you've been working on that, so that's not going to be a shocker. If you want to turn to page 193 in your textbook, we will start with chapter 11. This video will be on chapter 11, then there'll be one on chapter 16, and chapter 20 is so short, it'll be very, very quick. All right, so let's talk about decreasing risk exposure. The learning objectives, according to our book, are to discuss the importance of managing risk exposure in today's healthcare organization, analyzing the importance of using occurrence reports to decrease risk exposure, and talking about sentinel events and how those can point to important opportunities to improve safety in healthcare organizations. We also want to explain how risk managers use their skills in patient advocacy to lessen the impact that potentially compensable events, or PCEs, can have on healthcare organizations. And we want to evaluate the importance of National Patient Safety Goals, or NPSGs, for healthcare organizations and strategies for proactive risk reduction activities. Before I dive into this, I kind of want to give you a little bit of my background in that I have been a licensed risk manager in a former life. I was licensed by the state of Florida and actually worked as a risk manager in a hospital setting for a while. Throughout my career, I've been involved with risk management, and even my last position in the last hospital that I worked in, our healthcare organization, because it was a multi-hospital with physician practices, in quality management, I also did some risk work. So definitely accustomed to this topic. So let's talk about patient rights and responsibilities. We need to make sure that patients and family members are knowledgeable and realistic in framing their expectations of healthcare organizations and their providers. Doctors are not miracle workers. They cannot beat death or cheat death every time. There are some times when things happen and everything aligns and it all works out beautifully. Then there are times when things go wrong. Doctors are human. People make mistakes. How do we make sure that that is communicated appropriately? When do we apologize for when things go wrong? So making sure that patients understand their part in their care, the risks, benefits, and alternatives, and being realistic in expectations can go a long way. We also need to help providers, and that's providers of all sorts, remember to focus on their responsibilities that form the common basis of the patient-provider relationship, being respectful, being culturally competent, considering health literacy when they're communicating, um, understanding that these are individuals, not just patients. Sometimes we can lump people into a group setting and forget about the individuality of each one and what their needs are and how they can best be met. Sometimes as humans and caregivers, we're so busy trying to get the work done, we forget to take the time to be present in the moment. The other thing is that we all have things going on in our lives that distract us, and it's hard to walk in and leave all of our personal baggage at the door and move in and just care for patients. But yet that's what we're called to do. And when things bleed over, sometimes we forget to focus on the patient. And that's one of the things we need to do, is remind people what we're there for. We're there for the patient. A risk is an exposure to the that's a spelling error there. An exposure to the chance of injury or financial loss and its associated liability. Potentially compensable events are occurrences that involve liability for injury or property loss. Make sure that you know all of the key terms in this chapter, what they mean. They are in bright orange bold. Make sure that you are comfortable with all of those and knowledgeable about those. If you feel confused after you look in the book, um, make sh- make sure you flip to the back to the glossary and double check, because they may explain it slightly differently in the glossary, and that may make it make more sense. How do you decrease risk exposure? Because healthcare organizations are very susceptible to claims of liability. In fact, when I worked as a risk manager in Florida, this is no joke, this is no lie. We had a woman lay down on the front stone steps of the hospital and allege that she fell and that we were responsible for her medical bills. Um, she didn't have any injuries, but she felt that we should still pay her money. We had another situation where a young person left the ED and instead of staying on the sidewalks, decided to walk through the landscaping and tripped and fell, and felt that we owed them quite a bit of money because they walked through our landscaping instead of on the sidewalks, and got a little bit bumped, bruised, and that sort of thing. So healthcare organizations are very susceptible. And that's not even talking about the care. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong in healthcare organizations, and they are not necessarily the responsibility of one individual person. Oftentimes, they are systemic, that the process itself is very flawed, or that there were different checkpoints that should have stopped the event from happening, but they all failed. And so, just by the nature of their being, healthcare organizations are very susceptible. In 1999, the groundbreaking report from the Institute of Medicine called To Err is Human, Building a Safer Health System was published. And it really brought to people's attention how many medical errors were killing people. They patients who should not have died were dying, and it was significantly worse than the airline industry, um, tremendously worse. And that woke people up. If you've never read that report, please take some time to go out and Google it and read it. Um, it is hair raising. And unfortunately, in the 20 years since then, the 22 years since then, although there have been improvements, there's still an enormous number of medical errors that are occurring in healthcare organizations, specifically hospitals. Risk managers seek to manage the organization's risk exposure and improve its processes so the threat of liability is minimized. I'm sure in this chapter we'll talk about assessing for risks. That was one of the things that I did when I was in quality management, was I developed risk assessment forms and worked with different individuals in the organization as they assessed their risks to identify what were the risks, how significant were the risks, what could they do to mitigate those, what kind of risk did it put individuals at versus the organization versus finances versus reputation versus all sorts of things. So I'm familiar with that. So step one, you have to have a risk management plan. What are you doing to assess your risks, manage your risks, and all of that? You have to have an insurance strategy. You have to have a certain amount of money in reserves, because the things you fear the most will happen at some point, sooner or later. No matter how good you are, no matter how great your organization is, sometimes things go wrong. And that's not necessarily one individual's fault. It just happens. You're going to need to have insurance, because you will have to do payouts. And a lot of times, healthcare organizations choose to settle their issues rather than taking them to court. So, like for medical malpractice, they'll do a settlement, a private, confidential settlement, and that involves an insurance payout. You have to have a claims tracking and negotiation system, so that as you are managing your claims and paying them out and whatnot, you have a way to manage that. You have to look at how databases are maintained and have risk management reports be developed. And a lot of risk reports come out of incident reporting. So you've got to have a very robust incident report system to be able to pull that to manage your risks. You need to be able to review operational policies and procedures of all departments to ensure that they have been designed in a way that reduces risk exposure. You need to define requirements of occurrence reporting to insurers, licensure agencies, public health departments, governing bodies, the National Practitioner Data Bank, and other accrediting and regulatory agencies. So risk is involved with every department in the hospital, every single one, in some way, shape, or form. Because they've got to make sure that the policies and procedures are there, but also what gets reported within and outside of the organization, they need to double check. Step 2 is the risk management team needs to teach risk management concepts and principles to all employees. It can be something as simple as hand washing technique. It can be needle safety protocol, making sure that healthcare providers and caregivers do not leave uncapped needles in bedding where housekeepers are at risk of a needle stick. It can be instant documentation and reporting and helping people understand an incident report is not to get you in trouble. An incident report is to say XYZ happened and the organization needs to be aware of it. It should never be part of the medical record, ever, ever, ever. If you are working in an HIM department and you find an incident report, do not scan it into the medical record. Get it to risk management. It does not belong in that medical record. Otherwise, you're making it discoverable, and that is not something you want to do. Think back to your release of information legal affairs class a year ago. Step 3, the team evaluates occurrence reports. Have to be done. Every single occurrence report that comes in has to be reviewed. It has to be thought over. And then you have to figure out not only what data you're going to pull from it and keep, but how you're going to follow up and how you're going to track it and trend it to see, is there a trend? Is there something going on here? Is this a one-off situation? And what's going to happen? Are you going to do some additional training? Is there a piece of equipment that needs to be pulled out of use? What's going on? Step 4, the risk management team examines structure, process, and knowledge issues. They use the data collected and reported from all sorts of areas, and they determine corrective action and strategies to reduce risk. This was another thing that I did also through quality management. Looked at deaths, looked at significant injuries, looked at those healthcare acquired conditions, looked at healthcare acquired infections, followed through to see, were we in a situation that we were putting the organization at risk? Were there some steps that needed to be put into place to mitigate it? Did we need to tighten up controls? Did we need to write a policy and procedure and educate? Those types of things. There's just so much to consider, but you have to do that based on data. If you don't have the data, nothing makes sense. You can't see if there's a trend. Step 5, team identifies practice patterns, trends, and risk occurrences, and sentinel events. So you use that aggregated data to identify trends, sentinel events. Each one of those has to be managed specifically. I worked in an organization where every single sentinel event, a root cause analysis was done on it. And I think that's a great way to approach it. Even things that were not sentinel events, they did root cause analyses on that were near miss sentinel events. I think that that's a great way to identify the gaps in processes and breakdown and communication and all sorts of other things that you can work on and improve to prevent sentinel events. A sentinel event is a horrible thing because it's an unexpected occurrence that involves death or serious injury or the risk thereof. Near misses include occurrences that do not necessarily affect an outcome, but if they were to reoccur, they carry significant chance of being a serious adverse event. The credentialing of physicians and the validation of nurses and other clinicians' licenses to practice is a huge area of risk. Having been over medical staff services, having done credentialing and privileging myself, having sat in on numerous med exec meetings, having pulled together the agenda for those, having been involved in situations where providers had significant issues that impacted their ability to perform, and discussion had to be held about next steps. Um, I get this. I understand this. It's very serious. And it's super confidential. You can never discuss it. What you see and hear ends there. And so you have to keep all that in mind. But you have to be aware of it. You have to be watching. You have to constantly be checking. A one-off may not be a one-off if you're not looking for patterns or trends, or if you don't have the software ability to look at data over time, or slice it and look at everyone that's performing that procedure, or every procedure that's performed in that OR room. Step 6, the team provides direction in the patient advocacy function, making sure that the patient has support through difficult interactions with the healthcare organization. Patients are not always happy, and they're not always going to be happy with some of the answers that have to come from risk management. Sometimes, as a risk manager, you're the person who gives the patient or their family the bad news, or the news that the hospital is standing on this ground and not moving any further. You have to do what's best for the organization, but you always hope you can do what's best for the patient as well, and you really try and find that common ground. But there are difficult interactions that have to be held. Sometimes a patient doesn't want to hear that some of the actions that they took impacted the outcome and what happened, that maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if the patient hadn't done XYZ. So sometimes you're dealing with that. Sometimes you're dealing with angry families, and they are justifiably angry. I'll give you a personal example. My grandfather died through medical malpractice. He was in for colon cancer surgery. He was 63 years old, very healthy. They found stage 1 colon cancer. They decided to take out a section of his colon. While he was on the OR table, he experienced cardiac arrest. And it so shook up the surgeon that the surgeon failed to stitch up half of his bowel and closed him up. Now, this has been a number of years ago, and medical technology has come a long way. When he suffered for a couple of months before he passed away. And by the time everyone figured out what was happening and transferred him to a tertiary care hospital, a major medical center, it was too late. He was too weak for them to do the surgery that they needed to do. Had he been transferred within a week to 2 weeks of the surgery, and had current day technology been available, I know he would have lived. But it was back in the time when there weren't quite as many bells and whistles technology-wise, and my grandmother didn't have the foresight or the willingness to listen to transfer him sooner. And my grandfather trusted his physician, the surgeon that made the error. But I remember being so angry, so furious. And I can only imagine how I would have been as a patient family member if I had sat down with the hospital after my grandfather had died and had a conversation about what happened. Whether that was with the risk management team, whether that was with the surgeon, that would have been a very difficult interaction. And the risk management department would be caught in the middle because they knew the truth. An autopsy report proved what had happened. The surgeon knew what had happened, or at least he would have after he read the autopsy report. And how do you go through that with a patient and their or a patient's family? How do you say, "I'm sorry, we screwed up"? There are those difficult interactions that have to be held. And how do you do it in a way that brings closure, that brings acceptance, um, that sort of thing. So it's incredibly challenging and stressful. If you go into risk management, just know it will press you to the wall every single day. It is one of the most stressful areas of the hospital. You have to make sure that the patient and or their family know the facts that are associated with an occurrence. You have to be honest, but you have to do it in a way that hopefully, like I said, brings acceptance. So I have taken the experience with my grandfather with me throughout my healthcare journey. It has influenced me in that I don't ever want another patient or patient's family to go through something like that again. Um, it has helped me with providers who are human and make mistakes, um, and that they get shook up at times. But how do they bounce back from that? How do they recover from that? How do they get someone else involved as early as possible to turn it around so it doesn't result in death? And what happens when it does? What happens when that nurse administers the wrong medication and feels horrible? Um, yeah, there's a lot to it. But you've got to be there for the patient and advocate for them as well as for the organization. Step 7, the team communicates all relevant data and information to legal support when potentially compensable events occur. And that's not just risk management. If you go into HIM, you are going to run across things in the chart that are not right, that are not good, and you need to bring them forward. One of the things I said to all of my coders multiple times a year is that if you see something, you need to shoot me an email. I'll go in, I'll review, and then I will alert patient safety, quality management, and legal. And that's what we did. And a lot of times we were the first ones to report it. Either an occurrence report hadn't been done or it hadn't come through. And I can't tell you how many times legal, patient safety, risk, quality management told me, "Thank you. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have known." So don't just think it's occurrence reports. Don't just rely on somebody else to report it. If you see it, if you run across it, you need to shoot an email to somebody about it so that they're aware. And then, of course, the risk team works with legal to coordinate legal activities, responses to subpoenas, completion of interrogatories, coordination of all employee depositions or court appearances, and then, of course, communicates with the organization's insurer. A lot of times risk and the hospital's legal department are one and the same. They will have individuals within the legal department that are more involved in risk, but they usually work together very, very closely. The risk team and legal counsel lead the development of an appropriate insurance strategy for the organization to make sure they're appropriately covered and have enough in cash reserves. They stay on top of what legal cases are happening and at what stage they are in. They also make sure that their insurance matches their service lines. If you deliver babies, if you have an OB program, you're going to need a heavy insurance strategy for that versus if you're a hospital that doesn't deliver babies. If you're a hospital that has an ED, which basically everyone does, there's an insurance strategy right there because the ED is one of the biggest places that you could have issues come up that turn into legal liability. If you do transplants or you do major surgeries like cabbages where you're risking death, you're going to need a significant insurance strategy. If you live in a state that is very litigious, For instance, I've worked in Michigan, Florida, Indiana, North Carolina, and Iowa. They are all very different in terms of the level of litigiousness that they have, and the insurance strategy and cash reserves needs to reflect that. So, QI toolbox techniques. Let's talk about cause and effect diagrams. And this is on page 210 in your book. It's called a fishbone. I know it mostly as a fishbone, but it's also known as cause and effect. And this is really helpful sometimes when you're trying to get to the root of something and figure out what all could possibly be involved in causing this. So I really encourage you to familiarize yourself with cause and effect diagrams and a fishbone. You may even want to choose something in your life and do a fishbone on it. So let's say, I don't know, let's pick something. All right, I'm gonna pick on my son. He brought home a less than acceptable grade, and I won't tell you what it was. But this is a child who is ahead in his reading and reading comprehension, but he brought home a grade that did not reflect that. And I wanted to get to the bottom of why he got that grade and why it didn't reflect his ability. And so if I wanted to, I could do a fishbone on what's going on. I could look at his methods for reading in class and reading and being tested by his teacher. I could look at his methods for studying and reading at home. Not necessarily manpower, but how much time is he spending on these tasks? Machinery, that really doesn't apply, but I can think about books. What interests him? Do we need to have him reading more at home than he has been? And do we need to find him different books that are more challenging for him, but that he enjoys reading? And I guess that kind of falls into material. But then, it's the effect. What's happening? So for us, the effect was his less than acceptable grade. And the causes we went back through and we figured out that he's rushing. He's not reading things that he enjoys, and so he's rushing. And when he rushes, he slurs his words, he skips his words, he's not really paying attention. But when we slow down and we work with him, we have him read a book that he enjoys, he will be glad to chatter about it and explain what he's been reading, and he reads so much more clearly. So that would be an example of using a fishbone diagram. Root cause analysis, or an RCA. This is on page 212 in your book. This is where you evaluate all aspects, human, procedural, machinery, and material, to identify how each contributed to the occurrence of the event. And then you try and develop new systems that will prevent reoccurrence. So you ask the question why. And you want to ask it like 5 times. You want to go back to like the 5th why. So an example of a root cause analysis for us, using my poor son as an example, is I would say, Carl, why did you get that grade? And then we would talk about what led to the grade. That he has a substitute teacher who tested him. Okay, what about that scenario? Why does that have anything to do with it? Well, she's not his regular teacher. His regular teacher's on maternity leave, and she may not know what he has done in the past or what she has done with him in the past. Okay, why? Well, maybe she's picked books that he has indicated he has an interest in, and that the substitute teacher didn't know that. And why? Did the teacher not pass that information along? Did my son not tell the substitute teacher about that? So you keep asking why to get back to what really ultimately caused it, and what could you change in the future so it didn't happen again. So you've got cause and effect, or the fishbone, where you're looking at manpower, material, methods, and machinery. And this is what it looks like. And it's just like the one in your book on page 211. And then RCA, it's Y. Keep going back, Y, 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 Y. And this is a visual for that, page 212. And that is it for chapter 11. I will be back shortly to talk to you about chapter 16. Yes, chapter 16. All right, take care.